Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Allison Kooser. As the Chief Storyteller at Swell+Good, Allison helps nonprofit organizations share their stories, reach more people, and raise more support. She has previously led donor acquisition and outreach for Opportunity International and served as a lead copywriter and marketing strategist for the Chicago Sun-Times. Allison might also be the only person I know who has even weirder habits than me, which I'm not sure I'm relieved or envious about. Ladies and gentlemen, Allison Kooser. Allison, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Francisco.
Just so I don't leave that one hanging, my very weird habits are that I only eat in the evening with the vast majority. When I'm not cooking romantic lunches for my wife, as I did today, I have freezing cold showers pretty much every day. And I create weird rules for myself that I feel obliged to follow. Um, you do a few weird things too, right?
I think so. I like to consider them habits as opposed to weird, but sure. I'm also
so,
interested in the rules, but yes.
so
Um,
you don't you wake up at 5:28 every morning?
I do. I wake up at 5:28 every morning. Really, that's a hangover from setting an alarm one time for 5:28 and it worked. And then you save that alarm in your iPhone and it goes off every day. But I do like waking up before the sun for sure.
Yeah, so I think waking up early used to be way weirder than it is now. Isn't there like a 5 a.m. club or something like that? But 5:28 is very specific. And the other thing, and again, this is perhaps not a habit, but you've created a rule for yourself about not buying pretty much anything, and you made yourself keep it for a year.
I
So,
did. Yeah, I did a no buying year, which is a great experiment. I really do enjoy running these experiments on yourself. Think of it as a New Year's resolution that has an end date, perhaps. So I did a full year of no buying and I recommend it to folks. It's really fascinating to see what you already have and how you can use what you already have more effectively.
I think you might be slightly confused there because all New Year's resolutions have an end date. It's usually
Yeah,
3 days
January 10th
after.
or something,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yes. It's not as if all of us are just going to the gym indefinitely after
Right, right,
eating
right.
healthily
Very
and going
true.
to the gym. Since the last time we decided that, but
Mm.
you also bringing slightly more to the some of the stuff we're going to talk about. You also read, is it 50 books that you try to read every year?
Yes, I try to read 50 books a year, and I've been doing that since, gosh, 2011. So it ends up being a lot of books. And I'm
Yeah,
a
no,
writer. So.
I'm very aware of how many books that is because I didn't set out to read a specific number, but I remember a few, maybe 5 years ago, I decided to just count how many. I
Mhm.
realized I had read a lot in that year, and I decided to count how many books that was, and I ended up at like 80 something.
Wow.
And then I said, could I get it to 100? And I think I've only managed to do it once because
Mhm.
otherwise you get to a point that is just ridiculous. Like, no, no, one will read is too big next year. But yeah, but
Exactly.
I think that my lowest year in the last five has been something like 76 books, and my
Mm.
highest has been 104. But then
Wow.
again, I started reading some fantasy or science fiction, and there's like
Right.
10 books in a series, and that's 1 week and a half and I've read 10 books. So it's not all the what is the name of the Sartre, that's not a Sartre, the Proust book, the Memory of Lost Time or whatever that is. So
Mhm.
it's not all edifying reading. A lot of that stuff is kind of embarrassing, but
Yeah, there's stuff to learn from even embarrassing books, I think. So read what you love.
yes, yes, very much so. All right, so one of the things I liked when I started, I can't remember if I read this or if I heard you say this, but I think you described your work as something like, I help people come up with stories for when their work or the influence they're trying to have is far from where they are. Basically,
Mhm.
can you? you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the majority of the clients we work with at Swell+Good are nonprofit organizations that work all over the world. And quite often, they're fundraising in a community that is either physically or conceptually far from where they're working, right? So, that could be anything from implementing a program in rural Zambia and raising money in the United States to raising money on the North Shore of Chicago and implementing programs on the South side of Chicago. Those are still worlds apart in many ways. And what I think is really powerful about the stories that we tell and the stories we tell for organizations is that those stories serve as a bridge between those two communities. It's what connects that over there, which is really easy to kind of keep an issue at arm's distance, especially when those issues are hard, with me right here, who might have more resources to be able to be part of an initiative. And so I think that the story serves as that connecting point, particularly the more you can humanize and tell something impactful that connects, right? The story is the connection point. And so I think that it lets people get close, especially in COVID times, right? Where we can't go physically quite often. And even in non-pandemic times, most people won't go. And so how can you bring those two communities together more closely? And that's what our stories hopefully do.
So now that you mentioned COVID, that has changed dramatically the way you work, right? Because if I understand correctly, before COVID, you were a traveling story hunter.
I was, yes. So pre-COVID, I was on airplanes a lot. And then that all sort of stopped, right? So now, thankfully, because of technology, we're able to connect pretty well virtually. It's also required us to rely a lot more heavily on local storytellers, which actually I think is better for our business and better for the stories we're telling in many ways. So figuring out how do you equip and resource people who are already part of the community to be your eyes and ears and get the stories and conduct interviews and take photos and then pass those along. There still is that bridge building element, right? So we're here, I'm based in the United States, and we're still here communicating with our donor groups and people here, but the bridge kind of has a second end, right? Now on the other side. It doesn't require me getting on a plane and going necessarily, though I do miss travel a lot and I'm eager for the day when I can go back to some of these communities.
Yes, you are at a complicated moment whereby you perhaps trying to justify to new clients or even to old clients how it's you can absolutely do the same job now even though you cannot travel,
Right.
but as soon as you can travel you need to find the justification for no, but now you
Exactly,
need to get me
exactly.
there. Like I know it
Hmm.
was working perfectly, but you have no idea how much better it's going to work
Right,
if I'm in
right,
Zambia one week and if I'm in somewhere. So
right.
I want to talk about a fair bit about what types of stories and
Mhm.
what you find that works and what doesn't. But let me just take one step back, which is, isn't storytelling the most obvious thing that every nonprofit or charity organization should be doing? But I mean, I'm sure they're not. But isn't this like the most obvious thing that they should
Yes,
go? Yeah, well, we have that covered. We're messing up in all sorts of other ways, but the
right.
storytelling part we understand. But that's not
Yes.
your experience, right?
No, and I think what happens a lot, rightfully so, is that there are thousands, literally thousands of organizations that are started by founders who are really good at doing whatever the implementation program is, right? So you have a social worker or you have a community development expert or an economic development expert, and they are starting a program that does that. And at the end of the day, they're not marketers. They're not really fundraisers either, quite honestly, but they reach a point where they realize to do the work that they're good at, they need money. And the way that they raise money is by marketing and fundraising. Um, and especially all these small organizations, it's not a good use of resources, quite honestly, for them to staff full-time marketers at the beginning. It's expensive and presumably they'll be pretty pigeonholed on what they're able to do. And so that story kind of goes by the wayside or is reliant on somebody, sending emails to their personal network or something along those lines of, hey, I'm in the weeds every day on this work, and when I have time I remember to write some people about what's happening or record a video on my phone. And that's great, but it's not systematized, and so it's a really easy for that to fall off, right? Because you're prioritizing, as you should, the programs that you're trying to run, whether that's feeding people or serving women and girls or whatever the issue is, right? So we are able to come in and fill the gap and say, we're going to be dedicated entirely to story and telling stories that are intentionally designed to raise you money at the end of the day so that you can continue focusing on what you do best, which is the work. So, there are large nonprofits that have huge marketing operations, and those are the ones who are great at storytelling. And we look to them as examples and say, what can we borrow from them? They don't really need our help, but there are thousands and thousands who are much smaller who would love to tell great stories. They know they need to tell great stories. We do very little convincing of, hey, you should be telling stories. They know. It's just a matter of, is that a priority? Is there time? And whose job is it?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. I was going to ask you if there is still any pushback, because this is something that in different parts of the work I do and a whole bunch of other people that work with storytelling, you just find different levels of um, reluctance to do it, or people are skeptical about it. But it's interesting to know that in that world you live in, they're fully aware that this is a very powerful thing. But one of the challenges you mentioned is how organized they are about it. Now, organization aside, what would you say they find most difficult? Is it finding the right stories, crafting them in a way that they can actually share with donors or on social media? Or they can do those things, but they just they have no idea how to tell the stories.
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think in some ways, especially a founder led organization, right? So, really small staff, people who are very much in the weeds, their daily life is the story and it doesn't feel unique, right? It's what they're living. And if an outsider comes in and says, hey, actually, this is amazing, we should be telling this in a lot of places, it sometimes comes as a surprise because they are experiencing it on a day-to-day basis. It's normal, right? And doesn't feel, quote, newsworthy. But it is. And so I think that that's a big piece, is identifying that they actually do have a story worth sharing and figuring out what that is. And it's almost always right in front of their faces. I think a lot of times people don't feel like they are strong storytellers. And what they mean by that is they don't feel like they're strong writers. And so they are wary to try to put together something like a newsletter or a long form social post or blog or anything like that. And then I think the third thing is just time. Nonprofits are notoriously understaffed and under resourced. And so everybody's hustling and going a million miles a minute. And so if they need to do something, it's literally a matter of, where am I going to find 30 minutes to do an Instagram live? I don't have it. And so I think that is always a barrier. I do think, to your other point, something I just thought of that's interesting is the reason nonprofits are so cognizant of the power of story as opposed to a more traditional business might be, is because nonprofits don't have a product, right? The story is the product. What you're trying to sell is the story so that people feel compelled to give, right? So what people are paying for is the emotion and the heart and the impact. And the only way that gets communicated is through the story, as opposed to a brand with a product. There is something you're getting in exchange, and the story is kind of the mechanism for that, as opposed to the nonprofit organization where the story's all you have. That's it. That's what you got. And so I think that because of that, nonprofit leaders are a little bit perhaps more on board with content marketing in buzzword speak, but storytelling as a whole.
Yes, I think there is a very interesting contrast to what you just said, which I fully agree with. But then my mind, perhaps I'm too cynical, but then my mind went to all these products which are just things we don't need, that are not
Mhm.
particularly more special than anything else we already have access to. But then because there is a story, they become this super useful and necessary thing, and we're really buying the product. And I'm particularly thinking of, what is the name of that brand? Is it Yeti that does
Mhm.
the like the thermal cups? Yeah, so I'm from Brazil, and there's a version of that. It's called Stanley, the a Stanley cup, funnily
Mhm.
enough, in Brazil, and it's like this cup, thermal cup thing that you put your beer in, and it will take like an extra half an hour for the beer to get warm. And and so my friends, like, all of a sudden everybody has one of these things. They're really
Mm.
expensive, and I said, that's just like a thermos, isn't it? Like, you could just, because we've had thermos, because
Uh-huh.
in Brazil, people in the south of Brazil, we drink mate.
Mhm.
So everybody has a thermos. It's like, can you just not, like, you have one of those small thermos? I've seen it in your house. Use a small thermos. Oh no, but this is different. This cup is different.
Mhm.
Then they just come with some rubbish
Power of
story
marketing
about
right
why.
there. That is some
Yes,
good
yeah. I
brand
mean, it is.
management.
I mean, it's great. It's great marketing, but I just
Mhm.
think it's funny thinking like how no, these companies are giving us real products, real value. It's not
Yep.
a story.
Yep. Definitely.
uh, Something else you said, which I wanted to get back on, was this idea of how people can see how interesting their stories are. So
Mhm.
I've said this before, where if you don't think that where you are now is interesting, is usually because you can't see how far you've come. So for a lot of
Mhm.
people, that's the point, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It could be me being in Barcelona, having been originally from Brazil. There's a whole bunch of stuff that had to happen that to me is just like, oh yeah, this happened, and then this happened. I got dumped, and then I got sad, and then I traveled to this country, and then I left it. But to a lot of other people, it's like, wow, you've
Mhm.
crossed the world, you've done this, and it's like, yeah. And I wonder why that is. I don't know if it's just we we think so little of ourselves that we automatically think that if we are doing it, it can't be that special.
Yeah, and I think because we experience our stories day by day, we aren't we're rarely pulling back and looking at kind of this overarching narrative, right? We're looking at today I woke up and I drank coffee and I did my work and I replied to emails. And in the minutia, it's not that interesting, right? But if you take a step back and say, "Oh, in 5 years, I built a business." That is a cool story, but it's pretty rare for people to do that to their own lives, right? And I think too, you see the highlight reels of other people's stories and you see the inner workings of your own, and so it's really easy to celebrate the highlight reel, and it's harder, I think, to craft your own highlight reel in a way that comes off genuine and true and celebratory as opposed to cocky or you know out of touch with reality or something.
Yeah, so I do a practice that I've mentioned a number of times on the podcast called Homework
Mhm.
for Life, where
Mhm.
I write down every day, like if I had to tell a story about the day, what would it be? Either something that happened or something that I remembered, and and it's kind of surprising how it forces you to reevaluate things you thought were very small or nothing. Yesterday I sat down to write down my homework, and I'm like, there's nothing happened today. Like nothing. I stayed at home working all day. There was nothing particularly interesting. My kids came home, it's just normal stuff. And then I realized that I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old,
Mhm.
and at one point the 2-year-old was going completely mental about something nonsensical, and
Mhm.
I kind of took her out of the kitchen and kind of said, like, if you seem very tired, you kind of freaking out over nothing, maybe you want to go to bed. And she was like, no, oh no. And then she came back to the kitchen, and thinking about it later, I thought, this is the very first time that I've genuinely treated the 2-year-old as someone who might be doing something wrong and
Mm,
needs to be educated about it. Like, this is the very first time that she's, in my head, she stopped being a little baby who doesn't know what she's doing and
right.
has become a person who
Mhm.
has to understand that if actions have consequences.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't have figured that out, that was the moment it happened, if I hadn't stopped to think about it. And again, I'm
Definitely.
talking about very small things on a normal day. These people are doing charity initiatives, sometimes in the other side of the world. There
Mhm.
must be 15 different things that they're doing on a daily basis that to most other people would sound fantastical.
Absolutely. And it's things that, you know, I love that story. One, because that is a story that is both very specific and universal, you know? And so I think that that's what builds a great bridge. But that's true of these organizations too. I think that the flip side of not knowing their story is they get caught too big in the story of we are impacting 8 million lives. And that's hard to connect with as well. And so really where we often land is, can you find one person? What happened to that one person? What was the interaction with that one person? And this isn't unique to us. This is, nonprofit marketing 101, but it works because somebody far away can connect with that one person and they can see themselves in the experience. So, a mother in rural India and a mother in Austin, Texas, their lives look very different, but they're still moms. They still want their kids to learn. They still want to put food on the table. Those experiences are shared. So that's where the bridge comes in. And those are the stories we try and tell.
So there's something. So yeah, I agree that the one person is, it's not, you guys didn't invent that. I think pretty much anyone that works with stories specifically should, if they don't do it, they should be doing it, is telling
Right.
everybody, if you want to tell me, I often say this, if I want to tell you how crazy my family was, I'm not going to tell you about my whole childhood. I'm just going to tell you about one Christmas dinner.
Right.
And then you get a picture. So I always say it's, focus on one person and one moment in time. Don't tell me about the mom in India over how it is for her over years. Just
Right.
if you can, pick one thing that happened to her that
Yep.
illustrates the rest. So which brings me to something that in my head I think of as the Rokia paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with the Rokia study done by Carnegie Mellon. So this is something that I can't remember now if it was in Made to Stick or if the guys who wrote Made to Stick talked about it somewhere else and it got popular because of that. So this is a study from Carnegie Mellon, I believe, where they gave people this charity story, right? And they talked about Rokia, who is this fictional little girl in Mali, and there's a lot of hunger going on because of a wheat shortage or whatever. And then they asked people to donate money, and they donated something like $2.38. That was the average. Then they gave them, instead of, they didn't tell the Rokia story, they just gave them a whole bunch of data. This is how many millions of children, blah blah. And then the donations went down by half. And then they tried both things together. They gave them the story about a girl and added all the data on top. And strangely, to my mind, the donations were higher than if you just given them the data, but still lower than if you had just given them the story. So I think it was something like they went up from 140 to about 170, but that was still a fairly substantial amount lower than with just the story. So when you're helping organizations find the stories that they want to tell, do you always sort of ditch the data completely? Do you still have the data somewhere in there? How do you
Yeah.
navigate that
You
world?
definitely need the data. And there's something to be said here for audiences as well, right? So who is going to be hearing the story? And I do actually remember that study reading about it. And a key factor there is kind of this mass market audience, right? Someone who's unfamiliar and a general public. In those instances, the human story is going to be the connection point, and the data quite often will bog down the story or make people feel like this problem is so big that my $10 is not going to do anything. The data becomes really important when you're telling a story to a major donor or an investor or someone who is looking to have perhaps a more specific and particular impact. So, if someone is preparing to give $100,000, that data becomes essential, right? That's what you're reporting on and showing impact over time. For my neighbor who's going to give $10, that story is going to be really important. And so it's a matter of who you're talking to and who your audience is. I do think there are some interesting use cases for data, but what people try to do is put everything in at once. And so when I've seen data work really well is you have one key stat, and it could be a big number, but that one number, people latch onto it and they get it, as opposed to let me rattle off these 9 bullet points that are all really important data points, but there are so many and they're so huge. And especially I work with a number of clients who work in global poverty, right? The numbers there and the things you're dealing with there are enormous. You're dealing with, okay, extreme poverty has increased because of the pandemic by 150 million up to 800 million. You're like, what are we talking about here? These numbers are inconceivable in many ways, as opposed to, hey, here's a family. This is what this looks like. This is what has happened to them over the last 2 years and why your support matters, why it matters to be, investing in extreme poverty alleviation. And then if you want, you can try to start extrapolating that to a larger scale. But I think the big numbers especially get very overwhelming very fast, particularly for people who don't have the capacity to give enormous amounts of money. You want to make a difference with your giving, right? And so you want to see how that giving can make a difference to one person, especially if you're giving small dollar handles.
Okay, so we talked about some of the stuff that works. We talked about some of the stuff that doesn't work, namely big numbers and big data on their own, or depending on your audience, numbers that feel like their contribution is irrelevant. What else doesn't work? What are typical mistakes that you find within organizations that maybe have tried to tell stories before, but didn't really get the type of result that you know that they should be getting or could be getting from them?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to try, right? And what's interesting about nonprofit storytelling is you can try a lot, and depending on the organization, something might work or might not work, depending who you're speaking to. I do think there are some things that generally don't work great a lot of times. I think people lose specificity, not only in single person narrative, but in what they're actually talking about, right? Especially an organization that's doing a lot of work. If they try and talk about all of their programs at the same time, it gets really confusing and also immediately gets vague. And as soon as you're getting vague, it's hard to know what's happening and why things matter. And we do agriculture and education and hunger programs and healthcare. And you're like, okay, what? That's a lot. So I think that is a challenge. I think not knowing who you're speaking to. I know I just was talking about audience, but not knowing who you're speaking to is a big challenge. So we do a lot in our work with segmentation and targeting to make sure that the right story is going to the right person, in the sense of, is this somebody who knows your organization well, in which case you don't need to get into the minutia of how you operate. You can just talk about the issue at hand. Or is this a brand new prospect, in which case, what do you even do? Start at square one, do a 101, handhold people through the process. I think on social, people get nervous to get too honest, in the sense of, I remember when Instagram stories first launched in, gosh, what was that? August 2016. I was traveling full time at the time for clients, and Instagram storied I was in Colombia, and I was Instagram storying every day behind the scenes, like, hey, we're walking down the street and doing meetings. And it was pretty boring in the scheme of things. It was not very profound, but partially it was novel, and partially it was
it was only boring, Allison, because you were going through it day by day. To other people,
exactly,
it wasn't boring.
exactly. So those day by day moments, people actually do care about, the kind of minutia of what's happening. People really get into. So I think that's, people forget that kind of thing matters. And then I think the last thing I would say is people get nervous to give any bad news in the nonprofit storytelling world. They want their stories to wrap up with a happy bow. Obviously, there is an element of hope that hopefully exists, because otherwise, why would people be compelled to give? But these are hard situations, and things do not always go well, right? And especially storytelling on the backside of a gift. So if someone has donated to a program and the program doesn't work the way that we might hope it would, what I've seen be really effective is telling that story as it actually happened, being honest and upfront, as opposed to trying to sugarcoat something. I have clients who work in sexual violence. That's a hard topic. That is never going to be all rosy and done, right? And so the honesty is scary to put down and make permanent, but I think it's really important. So we always encourage people to be upfront, and you don't have to it's not therapy. You don't have to divulge everything, but I think the honesty really helps.
Although, having said that, one of the, I'm not sure if it's one of the most successful cases, but at least is a successful case that I know about,
Mhm.
is Charity Water. And
Absolutely.
there's storytelling approach. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know this, and I don't remember the exact story, but essentially the guy who runs Charity Water was a big party guy,
Mhm.
and had done all, like, he spent all his time partying like a crazy person and drinking and doing drugs and all this stuff. And I can't remember what exactly put him towards the charity world, but I know that when he started fundraising, he was just sharing all of that stuff. He was basically
Mhm.
saying, I was a fuck up, I did this, I did that, and
Mhm.
all these horrible things, and then I kind of saw the light,
Mhm.
and didn't hurt his fundraising efforts at all.
No, Charity Water is, well, the best in the business, quite honestly, of nonprofit storytelling, partially because they employ a team of creatives and marketers very intentionally because storytelling is such a central part of their work. But Scott Harrison, the founder, his story is exactly that, right? He is excellent, excellent at celebrating. And so he is very good at taking people along for the ride and making them feel like they are part of this party happening. And as a result, they have mastered what we call peer to peer fundraising, but basically a lot of small gifts. They're exceptional at that because they get people into these movements and they feel like they're part of something, and they give. And so it's really cool to see. And they do. I mean, if you go to their website, they're doing all sorts of cool stuff and creative stuff with a full creative team, which is very cool and inspiring for our work as well.
I heard him talk about some a slightly different way of using story that perhaps is a lot more common in the corporate world
Mhm.
than in other places. But it was him talking about the story not as a fundraising tool, but as a motivational tool
Mhm.
within the organization. And I think what he actually said was something like, I think he was feeling that he wasn't making enough progress, or he wasn't, I don't know, he was just wasn't feeling it. There was something off, and he said, I needed a new story to reconnect with that purpose.
Mhm.
So he went to one of the places where they did a lot of work and talked to a lot of people, and then, it was something like there was a tree, and people left some gifts, or some objects near the tree, and he wanted to know what they were doing that for. And it was to do with this person who was this woman who used to walk, I don't know how many miles, to find water. And when one day she came back and stopped by the tree, put the water down, collapsed, and I think she died.
Mhm.
And they celebrate her life and how great the person she was by leaving objects in by this
Mhm.
tree. And he says, yeah, that was it. This is why
Mhm.
we're doing this is why we're bringing water to this place, so this type of story doesn't have to happen. Then that became the new story that they told internally. I don't know if they used that for fundraising, but that became the story that they used to energize themselves and to
Yeah,
remind themselves of what they were doing it for.
that's huge. Yeah, story as a why. I mean, that's amazing. And I think that we're all telling ourselves stories regardless of what we're doing, whether we are verbalizing them or not. There are narratives we're telling ourselves about our work. And so if you're able to craft that and get your whole team on board with a shared story, that's amazing. I mean, that is like, here is the propeller to move forward. I think that that's really, really a great practice for an organization.
Something kind of obvious that we somehow have not talked about yet
Right.
is, and this could fall on the these things work or they don't, but when a lot of people think about nonprofit or charity stories, I think the go-to in most people's minds is a sob story. Okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to tell me about some poor child that is hungry, or something along those lines. And I've heard you say something like, that in your storytelling, you don't want to, or you refuse to use guilt as to guilt people into doing something. And I heard that, and the first thing I thought is, I don't think you would get on with my mom at all. But Uh, so just tell me about that, like, because I think to most people that's what charity stories
Mhm,
are about in a lot of ways, particularly
mhm.
to do with children. Is like, okay, you you piece of crap, you're spending money on a new, Yeti cup, and you're
Right.
not saving a child in Africa. So
Yeah.
why is that? Do you not do it because you just don't feel good about it, because it doesn't work that well, or what's the thinking behind it?
It does work. That's the challenge, right? It does work. So there's a reason that for decades you've seen infomercials with starving children and flies in their eyes, right? There's a reason that happens, and it's because it does raise money. But it immediately paints people as victims. And in my experiences, I've traveled a lot and I've met a lot of people who are living in extremely challenging circumstances for a variety of reasons, whether that's poverty or abuse or illness or a multitude of things. Um, and never once have I considered those people victims, nor do they consider themselves victims. They're in difficult circumstances, and there are many situations where they might need help with a specific thing. But at the end of the day, like you or I, they are the protagonist in their story, and they are doing the best they can with the cards they've been dealt. And so to paint them as this object, right? This is this poor baby who needs our help and can't do anything on their own. That's just not true. Um, you know, that's a child who has a lot of potential and perhaps extremely limited opportunities to realize that potential, but they're still a human. And so for me in my work, I think that the humanity of people and prioritizing the humanity of people, even if that makes the storytelling and at the end of the day, the fundraising more challenging, that's more important. That's the integrity of the work, right? And so I think about, you know, adults, even people who I work a lot with small business owners around the world. Traditionally, you might have heard of microfinance, right? People who are living on less than $2 a day and are starting businesses. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of women who have received microfinance funding to start their businesses, and every one of them thinks that they are doing something amazing because they are. They're a small business owner, right? And they um, maybe have increased their income from $2 to $2.50, which in our world is still impossible to imagine. But that's huge progress and that's moving forward. And so I try to do things that feel celebratory of that progress. You don't want to paint it as the story is over, yay, we did it, because you do need people to fund things. But there is a lot to celebrate, and there is a ton. We talk about being asset based, right? So there are a lot of deficits, and you can focus on those deficits really easily, but there are also a lot of assets. And so how can you use the assets to paint a picture that shows somebody as a full and complex human, um, with their own feelings, with their own agency, with their own dreams that are not the dreams we're putting on them? They're the dreams that they already had. One example, I take pictures often of these people I meet. I'm a photographer by, I would say, hobby and sort of trade, not very trained. But one thing I started doing a long time ago was I would take pictures of people when I'm kneeling and they're higher up, right? So from a down angle. And what that does is it kind of makes people look like heroes, right? And so even that posture of I'm going to kneel down and you're the hero here of this story. And yeah, of course they're facing challenges, but they're the ones who are the center. They're the protagonist. And so because of that, I try and avoid all the easy grief messaging. It works, but it feels very unhuman to me in many ways.
Now that you say that, I am now concerned about my parenting, because I realize that that's how my children see me. They're always from that angle, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure I'm coming across very heroic. I think
Uh-huh.
I managed to mess it up enough that not even the hero angle is doing it for me. Yeah, a couple of things from what you said. Well, the first one is that I think that if you turn the tables around, why the sub story, the problems with the sub story become a lot more apparent, because I think if you are the person running the nonprofit, and you maybe want to be using sub stories more, if you just if you're just talking to that person, say, okay, so when we pitch you to investors, should we
Mm-hmm.
say that you're a poor, useless thing that cannot do anything on your own, and please give us some money? Or should we say that you're someone worth investing in,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the obstacle stopping you from
Right.
doing all the things that you can do? And I
Mm-hmm.
think people very quickly realize that you don't want a handout, you want investment.
Right.
And
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the flip side of that too is for the donor, you know, buying into philanthropy because you feel guilty and like you're spending your money in bad ways. That's, you're immediately going to approach giving as an obligation or a penance or something, as opposed to, I am participating in philanthropy because I have been blessed with resources, or this is a joyful expression of generosity, or any of these more positive, or yeah, I'm investing in the potential of another person. Any of these more positive framings of why you would give money. I think that story is important on the other side as well.
yeah, and the other point as well is, and I can't recall the specific research I read. It might have been in the same article that talked about the Rokia uh,
Mm-hmm.
experiment, but it was something to do with how far, or how far or you can go with guilt.
Mm.
And if I recall correctly, it isn't very far.
Mm-hmm.
That it's very very quickly you burn out
Mm-hmm.
from
Yep.
reading sub stories. So you either end up sort of blocking the emails of that particular charity because you don't want to be made to feel bad every
Mm-hmm.
time an email comes through.
Right.
But it's also that what seemed to get people on board was the idea of this journey or this project you're now embarking on. So it was, you can do the sub story, but it's like, okay, it was horrible, now it's gotten better, so there's a bit of hope there, and it
Right.
can, maybe the next time can be a little better, and then there is a problem, but the problem is
Mm-hmm.
not they're still dying of hunger. Because if
Right.
it's that, 3 mails running,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's easy enough to tune out, just because you don't want
Mm-hmm.
to be made to feel miserable all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, it will work. It's kind of the same as emergency fundraising, which also works really well. It's kind of these blasts of, oh, I have to give to that because this is horrible and tragic. And then you're done, as opposed to you're buying into this much longer, much deeper, much more powerful story that hopefully will last years, and you will be part of the journey of the organization moving forward, which is what the organization wants at the end of the day, too. They want recurring givers and people who are part of the story that they're telling.
So when you used to go to these places and look for the stories there, what were you looking for specifically? What types of questions would you ask people to elicit some of the stories?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing in a lot of my work, and part of it is just the fact that I come in very much an outsider, right? I don't blend in very easily, especially in a lot of the communities in which I'm working. And so I think that my first priority always was to try and build a rapport with the people I would interview and sit with, in the sense of, I am excited to meet you. And you, to my point earlier, you are the protagonist here. Your story is what I'm excited to hear. And people generally have been waiting for a captive audience to share their stories, in my experience. Particularly people living in extreme poverty. No one is asking them anything about their lives and what they're excited about, or what they're hopeful for, or what they wish for their children. And so even just to sit and listen and say, hey, I am genuinely curious about your life and all of its ups and downs. I think that is the starting point of all of these conversations. And then when I started to get into it, I think, you know, children are a huge one. And it's kind of a universal experience of, what do you hope for your kids? Why are you prioritizing education for your children? Because everyone is, everywhere in the world, everyone is prioritizing education for their children. Even if they have no resources, that's the first place their money is going. Why? What does that look like? What does that make possible? I think it's really interesting to talk to people about dreams. Depending on culture, dreams for the future are either immediately on the tip of your tongue, or something you have never considered ever once. In some contexts, I remember being in Delhi in India, and I was interviewing women. I interviewed 300 women in Delhi over the course of 3 weeks, and it was crazy. And you would ask them about their dreams for the future, and it was blank because it was something that they had never considered or been given the opportunity to have, right? I think it's a result of a lot of different compounding factors, caste system, social hierarchies, extreme poverty, and a lot of religious mentality there as well, all compounding in the sense of the situation I'm in can't change, and therefore I just have to get through it. And it makes hope really challenging in that context. Whereas rural Africa, I would sit with women and say, what do you hope for the future? And immediately it's, I want to build my own house. I want my kids to graduate from high school. I want to grow my business and have a grocery store, or I want to buy a car or whatever. Culturally, that was a much more common practice, was to think about, okay, I'm in a challenging spot now, but what might tomorrow look like? So I think that those questions are really interesting. And then trying to just get into people's actual situations, right? Because despite all the hope and happiness for the future, of which there is a lot, the immediate situation is always hard, right? I'm meeting them and they're working with an organization because they're in some sort of challenging situation. And so trying to dig into both what is that situation and how are you surviving it? Those two pieces, I think, just require a lot of active listening and kind of picking at the threads that people leave untied a little bit. It's the same way for you and I. You're not going to immediately jump into your personal trauma or challenges that you're facing right now necessarily. But if someone asks you specifically about it because you've referenced it, you might be more willing to say something. I can think of one story of a woman in Malawi who I met named Mary, who, extreme poverty, really difficult economic circumstances for sure. But she had become this kind of community leader. And so for her, when she started telling her story, she was talking about her kids, kind of the normal narrative that I've heard a number of times. And she said, and I started volunteering at the hospital. So, okay, interesting. Let's talk about that. What does that look like? She started helping all these moms. Then we walked further down that thread, and she was helping moms with newborns because her kids were fully grown. And then she said, yeah, and, I was working with an organization and got a microfinance loan, and that helped me increase my income. And so I started telling these moms about how they could do microfinance, where, okay, next question. Turns out at the end of the day, she had so I was working with Opportunity International, which is a large microfinance organization at the time. And they work with trust groups. And she had single-handedly created 20 additional trust groups. So that's hundreds more women. And she would never just willingly share that fact. It took these okay, wait, hospital, tell me more. Moms, tell me more. Women, tell me more. Oh, yeah. I made 200 people get loans and grow businesses. And you're like, you started 200 small businesses. This is insane. So I think that's the journey, right? That's the story that they get uncovered in the truest sense. And then it's a matter of getting to bring those back and post them on Facebook or in an email.
Yeah, so part of me thinks you listen to the story and go, sister, let me tell you about something here. Bragging. It's a great thing. That's what
Yes,
Instagram and
exactly.
Facebook are
Tell me
for.
the
You're
things.
missing
Let's
out.
go. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, let's try on some selfies
Right.
and with some
It's the same
headlines
thing as
about
day
your
to day.
business achievements.
What we were talking about before of this is her daily life. She's like, oh yeah, of course I did that. I'm like, pause everything. This is enormous. What are you talking about? So I think that kind of thing, it gets lost because it's just regular for her.
One final thing that I thought about when you were describing before how important it is for people to know who they're speaking to. And it's not quite the same thing. But one thing I was trying to figure out was, so there's the cause, or there's the mission, or there's the project, or whatever, the work that these organizations are doing. And not knowing pretty much anything about this world, part of me thinks that before you know who you're speaking to, you need to know what stories you have to tell. So in my head, I'm thinking, doesn't the story come before the audience? Because if you don't know what stories you're going to share, how do you choose which audience to target so you know that those stories will resonate? So am I completely off track here, or there's some sense to that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit chicken and egg in some ways. You know, we create basically repositories of stories for a lot of organizations. So, these are the powerful things that illustrate impact. These are the 5 people who have really had a huge transformation because of services, something like that. So you have those kind of in your back pocket, but also nonprofits are choosing audiences really intentionally. And there is this kind of known segmentation of audiences in many ways for any organization. This is not specific, but you're going to have your existing donors. You're going to have prospects, meaning people who have indicated interest but haven't ever given. And then you're going to have some segmentation going on of capacity to give, right? So major donors, which are going to operate much more like investors, and mass donors who are going to operate much more like social media givers or something like that. So those audiences exist from the beginning. And so as you're uncovering stories and finding new stories, you kind of can target them accordingly to the audiences that exist. I think there's also, the last thing I'll say, probably time-wise, but there's this big narrative of the organization, right? And that's a fixed story in many ways. This is what the story of our brand is. And that is, us coming in and helping with a messaging architecture and how do we talk about ourselves and what is our brand narrative, right? And then there are all of these impact stories. And those are in many ways endless for a nonprofit because every single day they're doing work and every day there's a new story. So for your homework purposes, it's every day, what did we do and how are those cool things to share? And so I think you have your brand architecture and your narrative of the brand and the organization. And that's, that you have first before you have an audience, how you talk about yourselves. But all those individual stories, you're pulling them in and you're finding them as you go. And you might be thinking about one specific donor you have who is really excited about secondary technical education and they want to fund STEM in Uganda. And all of a sudden you're like, hey, wait, I have this STEM in Uganda student who now is learning to be a web developer. That one story is for that one donor, and that's it. And it's the only reason you care is because you had the audience in mind. So I think that you get a lot of those moments. It really is kind of this treasure hunting, right, for the stories in many ways, because in so many ways they're endless. There are amazing things happening every single day. And so it's a matter of which ones we want to tell and who do we want to tell them to.
And on that point, I agree. That should be the last thing we do say. So I was looking, doing my research as I normally do, and the platform that I use a lot, LinkedIn, is not the one you use a lot. So if people want to find out more about you and the work you're doing and follow up what you have out there, what's the best place for them to go to?
Yeah, so the best place is swell+Good.com. 2 things I'll point you there. One is a newsletter we put out every Thursday. So for sure, subscribe. You can subscribe right there. And you'll get both reflections from us on storytelling and work life and impact and all that good stuff, plus some links from other people's thoughts. And then you'll also see a huge aggregate blog on there, which is where we share a ton of our content that is free and available for anybody to use. And if you are a nonprofit interested in getting support in your own storytelling and fundraising, you can reach out there as well. And we would love to talk to you about how we can work together.
I'll stick all those links in the show notes, but I have to ask now because I couldn't quite figure out where does the name come from?
Yeah, so there's an expression, well and good, which is what kind of inspired it. But the swell and the wave, the idea is organizations already have a lot going on and they're ready for it. And it's how can we take what you have and make it bigger? So help you have a bigger impact, more influence, and swell the work you're already doing to do good.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I've scratched that itch. Thank you very much.
There you go.
Okay. Allison, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Francisco.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time.